War and the State. Part 3. The American Experience. Bruce Porter writes, "Throughout the history of the United States, war has been the primary impetus behind the growth and development of the central state. It has been the lever by which presidents and other national officials have bolstered the power of the state in the face of tenacious popular resistance. It has been a wellspring of American nationalism and a spur to political and social change. The absolute state of the late 17th and early 18th century was not the nation-state. There was no belief at this time that nation and state should necessarily coincide. This was to be the dominant ideology of the 19th century. Nationalism is also a powerful collective emotion, fixated on the mystical and mythical image of the nation. It is a kind of modern tribalism or political religion, capable of eliciting strenuous exertions, supreme sacrifices, and deeply felt hostility, above all in war and in connection with war. It is possible to see the nation-state as the more or less inevitable end result of the consistent development of the dynamics of absolutism. The idea of the nation as it merges with politics to produce the nation-state is more than the innocent, vague and ill-defined feeling of social solidarity we may have with those who speak the same language and follow the same customs that we do. It achieves a mythic reality which goes well beyond the mild emotion of social identification. The potency of myth is that it allows us to make sense of mayhem and violent death. By turning history into myth, we transform random events into a chain of events directed by a will greater than our own. Most national myths, at their core, are racist. They are fed by ignorance. And many intellectuals are willing to champion and defend absurd theories for nationalist ends. The Civil War had a major impact on taxation, bringing about the first tax on income in US history and, ominously, the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Although the income tax was repealed in the 1870s, many of the other wartime taxes remained in place. Along with the war and the tax increases, we saw an expansion in bureaucracy. Woodrow Wilson believed that the principal achievement of the Civil War was the creation of a national consciousness. From a libertarian point of view, this is not an unmixed blessing. It could be argued that the Civil War turned the states that were loosely united into the nation-state that is, the United States. I think it is significant that the term United States, although grammatically plural, now regularly takes a singular verb. In his 1915 State of the Union address, Woodrow Wilson declared, "There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags, but welcomed under our generous naturalization laws, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the authority and good name of our government into contempt. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." Wilson assured the American people that disloyalty would be strongly repressed, since any disloyal person had forfeited his right to civil liberties. In making these declarations, Wilson, as was the case with Lincoln some 50 years earlier, seemed to suffer from a form of selective amnesia. While president of Princeton University, he had published a book entitled Constitutional Government in the United States, in which he had maintained that unrestrained criticism and outspoken argument for change were the essence of a constitutional system. In a comment that could have been, and perhaps was, designed to fit Wilson, H.L. Mencken is scathing of what he calls the professional world saver. "His whole life," says Mencken, "has been devoted to the art and science of spending other people's money. He has saved millions of the downtrodden from starvation, pestilence, cannibalism, and worse, always at someone else's expense, and usually at the taxpayers." Wilson's activities were not without precedent, and the tendency to ride roughshod over freedom in times of war is not just a 20th century phenomenon. During the 1861-1865 American conflict, otherwise known as the Civil War, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus on 8 occasions, once nationwide, and even went to the extent of defying a writ of habeas corpus issued by Chief Justice Taney of the Supreme Court. During this conflict, between 13,000 and 38,000 men were imprisoned by military authorities, most for draft evasion, but some merely for exercising their right to free speech. The most spectacular instance of repression was the case of former Congressman Clement Vallandigham in 1863, who was tried by a military commission and imprisoned for characterizing the war as cruel and unnecessary, for asserting his First Amendment rights, and for urging the voters to kick Lincoln out. In fact, Vallandigham was imprisoned for doing little more than that which Lincoln himself had done in respect of President Polk during the War of 1848. Abraham Lincoln has become, remarks H.L. Mencken, the American solar myth, the chief butt of American credulity and sentimentality. The varnishers and veneerers have been busily converting Abe into a plaster saint, thus making him fit for adoration in the YMCA. He adds that the Gettysburg speech is poetry, not logic, beauty, not sense. Think of the argument in it. Put it into the cold words of every day. The doctrine is simply this: that the Union soldiers who died at Gettysburg sacrificed their lives to the cause of self-determination. It is difficult to imagine anything more untrue. The Union soldiers in that battle actually fought against self-determination. It was the Confederates who fought for the right of their people to govern themselves. Even before America's entry into World War I, the National Defense Act gave the President the authority to place orders with private firms that took priority over all other orders and contracts. Resistance to such orders permitted effective confiscation. Wilson arrested and jailed dissidents at a rate of knots that would have left Mussolini dizzy, and the very first Ministry of Propaganda was established in the United States to aid the war effort. With the US entry into World War I, the federal government expanded enormously in size, scope, and power. The government virtually nationalized the ocean shipping industry. It did nationalize the railroad, telephone, domestic telegraph, and international telegraphic cable industries. It became deeply engaged in manipulating labor management relations, security sales, agricultural production and marketing, the distribution of coal and oil, international commerce, and the markets for raw materials and manufactured products. Its Liberty Bond drives dominated the financial capital markets. It turned the newly created Federal Reserve System into a powerful engine of monetary inflation to help satisfy the government's voracious appetite for money and credit. In view of the more than 5,000 mobilization agencies of various sorts, boards, committees, corporations, and administrations, contemporaries who described the government's creation as war socialism were well justified. Not everyone was enthusiastic for war, and the myth that the outbreak of the war was greeted with universal acclaim is just another one of those facts that everybody knows that just isn't so. The Espionage Act of 1917, passed by Congress with some amendments, made it an offence to interfere with the draft or to spread rumours intended to undermine the war effort. The most spectacular conviction obtained under this act had to be that of Robert Goldstein, who had produced a motion picture about the American Revolution in which British soldiers were depicted bayoneting women and children in the Wyoming Valley Massacre of 1778. For this negative, if historically accurate depiction of the US's ally in the war against Germany, Goldstein received a 10-year jail sentence. Robert Higgs records that in California, the police arrested Upton Sinclair for reading the Bill of Rights at a rally. In New Jersey, the police arrested Roger Baldwin for publicly reading the Constitution. Against this background, and especially in light of the severity of the sentences meted out, no sensible person dared criticize the Wilson administration's policies. The Espionage Act was not enough. In 1918, the Sedition Act, shades of John Adams, was passed by Congress, forbidding any abuse of the government, the Army, the Navy, the US flag, or the uniform of the Army or Navy, or discouraging the sale of war bonds. It led to the banning of 75 periodicals and the denial of postal privileges to over 400 publications, the arrest of thousands without just cause, the support by the Justice Department of the 250,000 volunteers of the American Protective League to spy on their fellow citizens. The worst and most obvious infringement of individual rights was conscription. Some wondered why, in the grand crusade against militarism, the USA was, or were, adopting the very emblem of militarism. Speaker of the House, Champ Clark, remarked that, in the estimation of Missourians, there is precious little difference between a conscript and a convict. Despite the involuntary servitude section of the Constitution, the Supreme Court looked into its collective heart and mysteriously found conscription to be constitutional. 24 million men were registered and 3 million were drafted. To ensure that the conscription-based mobilization could proceed without obstruction, critics had to be silenced. The Espionage Act of June 15, 1917 penalised those convicted of willfully obstructing the enlistment services with fines as much as $10,000 and imprisonment as long as 20 years. An amendment, the notorious Sedition Act of May 16, 1918, went much further, imposing the same harsh criminal penalties on all forms of expression in any way critical of the government, its symbols, or its mobilization of resources for the war. These suppressions of free speech, subsequently upheld by the Supreme Court, established dangerous precedents that derogated from the rights previously enjoyed by citizens under the First Amendment. The supposed great dissenter on the Supreme Court, Mr. Justice Holmes, was singularly non-dissenting when it came to judicially evaluating cases brought under the Wartime Acts. H. L. Mencken writes, "In 3 Espionage Act cases, including the Debs case, one finds a clear statement of the doctrine that, in wartime, the rights guaranteed by the First Amendment cease to have any substance and may be set aside summarily by any jury that has been sufficiently inflamed by a district attorney itching for higher office." The government further subverted the Bill of Rights by censoring all printed materials, peremptorily deporting hundreds of aliens without a due process of law, and conducting and encouraging state and local governments and vigilante groups to conduct warrantless searches and seizures, blanket arrests of suspected draft evaders, and other outrages too numerous to catalogue here. War is the great stimulus to the restriction of civil liberties. The cry, "There's a war on," is justification for stifling dissent and imposing uniformity. The Committee on Public Information, set up by Wilson soon after the US's entry into the war, played a key role in raising anti-German hysteria. This committee was responsible for the release of government news at home and foreign propaganda. While the committee was not technically able to censor, its close links to the Justice Department and to the Post Office effectively shaped censorship policy. After the war, of course, remorse set in. Americans came to cast a jaundiced eye on the work of the Creel Committee, blaming the Committee on Public Information for fostering a national climate of intolerance and hysteria. Additionally, President Wilson's establishment of a centralized propaganda agency seemed to be a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of government. The Supreme Court had another mysterious change of heart, and now that it made little or no practical difference, overruled the majority of its World War I decisions, implicitly acknowledging that the convictions obtained under them were unconstitutional and had violated the First Amendment. In periods of war fever, we are likely to lose our sense of perspective and needlessly sacrifice fundamental liberties, particularly the fundamental liberties of those we already fear and despise. In both of these episodes, the President, the Congress, and the Supreme Court all failed in their responsibility to preserve and protect the Constitution, and the public sat by silently, or worse, cheered them on. The status of the presidency increased along with the increase in the President's power. The government took to itself the power to intervene directly in the economy under the National Defence Act and the Army Appropriations Act. All in all, transport, industry and agriculture came under direct federal control. Mencken remarked sardonically that most of England's appalling troubles today are due to a bad guess. She went into the war on the wrong side in 1914. The United States made a similar mistake in 1917. Our real interests at the time were on the side of the Germans, but we succumbed to a college professor who read Matthew Arnold. Like the prospect of death, war concentrates the mind wonderfully. In time of war, local differences and quarrels are sunk in the fight against the common enemy. If only society could be politically organised on a war footing all the time. The chief appeal of war to social planners isn't conquest or death, but mobilisation. Free societies are disorganised. People do their own thing, more or less, and that can be downright inconvenient if you're trying to plan the entire economy from a boardroom somewhere. War brings conformity and unity of purpose. The ordinary rules of behaviour are mothballed. You can get things done. Build roads, hospitals and houses. War is the opportunity for central planning with a vengeance. Just as the body in conditions of extreme cold focuses on the preservation of the essential organs and abandons, if necessary, the extremities, so too a planned economy abandons all the messiness associated with freedom and individual choice in the interest of perceived efficiencies. The government's organisation of the economy for war, more than anything else, determined how the central government would grow in the United States in the 20th century. And conscription, more than anything else, determined how the government would organise the economy for war. Thus, in a multitude of ways, the military draft shaped not only the contours of the nation at war, but the course of its politico-economic development throughout the past 80 years. In 1918, at the height of its powers, the War Industries Board controlled all available resources and could fix prices, at least wholesale prices. It also set production schedules, allocated resources, standardised procedures, coordinated purchase, covered costs, and guaranteed profits. Retail prices soared. The cost of the US's involvement in World War I was enormous. In money, about $33.5 billion, plus another $13 billion in veterans' benefits and interest on the war debt, as of 1931 in the dollars of those years. It increased bureaucratic control via the doubling of the federal bureaucracy, in central control of the economy via the National War Labour Board, which involved itself in industrial relations, working conditions, overtime, unionisation. And then there is a small matter of 130,000 combat deaths, 35,000 men permanently disabled, and perhaps also the 500,000 influenza deaths among American civilians from the virus the men brought back from France. In addition to all this, the indirect costs in the battering of American freedoms and the erosion of attachment to libertarian values were probably much greater. But, as Colonel House had assured Wilson, no matter what sacrifices the war exacted, the end will justify them. The end of creating a world order of freedom, justice, and everlasting peace. Denson remarks that, in the war-torn 20th century, we rarely hear that one of the main costs of war is a long-term loss of liberty to winners and losers alike. There are the obvious and direct costs of the number of dead and wounded soldiers, but rarely do we hear about the lifetime struggles of combat veterans to live with their nightmares and injuries. Nor do we hear much about the long-term hidden costs of inflation, debts, and taxes. Other inevitable long-term costs of war, which are not immediately obvious, are damages caused to our culture, to our morality, and to civilization in general. Two of the primary methods by which most modern governments conduct wars are conscription and propaganda. The winners have always written the history, and after the war, propaganda is often adopted as history and eventually becomes a myth or legend. We need to pierce through the walls of myth and propaganda to see what the true costs of war have been, especially to American liberty.